Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for people to be joining. I see there's a lot of people still joining. We'll just start in a minute or so. But welcome, everybody. While you're waiting, please introduce yourself to the chat. I see there's someone from sunny Croatia. Welcome. Is it sunny in Croatia? That's lovely to hear. And we've got from Colombia. Thank you. Welcome, Paula. It's even sunny in Maryland. The sun seems to be out. Fantastic news. Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to get started because we have a very busy agenda for today. So as people join, I'm going to welcome everybody. I am Elizabeth Dartnell, the Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And it is with great excitement that I welcome you all to the launch of the Shared Research Agenda on Child Sexual Violence for Low and Middle Income Countries. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Interpretation is available in Spanish, French, and Arabic. So simply just click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen to select your language. The webinar is being recorded. And the good news is that we will share the recording along with a list of resources with you after the webinar. Maybe you need to just give us some time to upload it, but we will share it as soon as possible. Please do, as you are doing right now, continue to share who you are, where you're from in the chat. And during the webinar, please share your questions in the Q&A box. You're welcome to ask your questions in English, Spanish, and French, and we will address them either online during the Q&A session, or if we don't have time to get to them all today, we will respond to you after the webinar. So just a quick overview of the agenda for today. We're going to begin with some opening remarks from me, followed by a presentation on the child sexual violence research priorities. And then we have a great panel of speakers representing different sectors who are going to share their insights on the agenda and how it can be helpful to their work before we move into our Q&A session and closing remarks. So to get us started, some just brief reflections from me. All of us here understand how deeply child sexual violence affects lives. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys is sexually abused. We all know the urgent need to provide quality services for survivors, while at the same time scaling up effective solutions to help end this violence. But to do this well, we really need the right evidence to guide us. Without high quality, relevant research, responses risk being ineffective, prevention programs fail to meet the real needs of survivors, and all programs are at risk of even doing harm. So to create meaningful, lasting change, programs and policies must be evidence-informed, and research must be shaped by those most effective or working on the front lines. When survivors, frontline workers, and others drive the research, it becomes more than just data. It becomes a catalyst for action, leading to stronger policies, better programs, and smarter funding decisions that can make a real impact. This agenda we're sharing with you today is built on this approach, developed through a rigorous, highly participatory and survivor-informed process to really ensure research is shaped by those with lived and frontline experience. By centering the expertise of survivors alongside researchers and practitioners, engaging with those working directly on the issue and applying an intersectional lens, this agenda identifies critical knowledge gaps, and it does lay the foundation for practical, impactful research that can drive change. Because of the careful and inclusive way this agenda has been developed, we are confident that it does provide clear strategic direction for researchers, policymakers, practitioners, funders, and more, helping us all focus our efforts where they will have the greatest impact. These priorities serve as a roadmap for action, and I urge all of us, governments, donors, civil society, survivors, researchers, please take up this agenda, fund its priorities, and translate its findings into stronger policies, programs, and frontline responses. just to remind us all that this is not a product of just one individual or one organization alone. It is a testament to the power of collaboration. I want to express my deep gratitude to our partners in this journey, the Safe Futures Hub, Together for Girls, the We Protect Global Alliance, and the Brave Movement for guiding this process with us. I also want to thank the advisory group and the Global Expert Group, many of whom are with us here today. Thank you. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and your dedication, which has really ensured this agenda is truly grounded in the realities of the field. And of course, a heartfelt thanks to our funding partner, the Oak Foundation. Without your support, we would not be here today driving this vital work forward. But this work, it does not end here. And this is a story or a message that's going to come throughout the webinar. We must take this agenda forward, ensure it becomes a catalyst for action, one that helps us create sustainable, long-term solutions to end childhood sexual violence and to build a world where no child is harmed. And with that, I am so pleased to introduce Joanne Njaji, who has guided us through every step of this journey. Joanne will now walk us through how this agenda was developed and the priorities it has generated. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Liz, for the inspiring welcome remarks. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Njagi. I'm the child sexual violence researcher at the SBRI, and I'll be taking you through the overview of the process, the agenda setting process, as well as the priorities. So I'll begin by highlighting the current state of CSV evidence and how that informs this agenda setting process. And so a scoping review of CSE evidence from 2011 to 2021 conducted by SVRI revealed a lack of cohesive evidence base for the field, coupled with methodological and knowledge gaps, as well as ethical concerns in available evidence. We also saw a lack of an intersectional approach with little evidence of vulnerable experiences of CSV among vulnerable populations. Most available evidence is from high-income countries, which is informed our focus on low and middle-income countries. So these gaps provide the basis for a collaborative, participatory, and inclusive collective decision-making process of setting research priorities and agenda for childhood sexual violence in low and middle-income countries. This approach recognizes that for far too long, research agendas have been set by too few, often the loudest, most senior in the room, a dynamic that we sought to change with this agenda setting process. So this shared research agenda serves several purposes. First, it allows us to identify research gaps, which then inform research planning and fundraising, as well as advocacy. The agenda also serves as a monitoring tool, which we will use to assess whether and how the research gaps are being bridged over time. And for us at SVRI, it serves as a guide for our grant-making processes. To facilitate this process, we use a CHINDRI methodology, which is a Child Health Nutrition Research Initiative. This is a methodology that is often used for systematic research priority setting. Whereas the CHINDRI methodology is largely quantitative, we drew on previous lessons from previous priority setting processes that SVRI and partners had facilitated. And we use this to make adaptations to the process. So a key feature of this adaptation was the incorporation of qualitative methods to facilitate inclusion of underrepresented groups, such as LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and also to include children, youth, and CSV survivors. So I'll take you through an overview of the process. We began with a scoping review, which we used to identify the domains under which the priority setting questions would be generated. And we identified 5 domains, and I'll be talking about these domains later in the presentation. We also established a stewardship and advisory group to provide technical guidance and, very importantly, to generate the research priority questions. And from this, we were able to generate 380 questions, which were not only generated by the advisory group, but also by children, youth, CSV survivors, LGBTQ plus people, Indigenous people, and people with disabilities. So the process, after this, we went through a RAG rating process, and the RAG rating stands for red, amber, green, which is a color coding process which allows for further prioritization. And this process was led by the stewardship group, out of which we generated 49 questions, which were then shared with a global expert group to prioritize the top priority questions, which I will be sharing in this webinar today. Out of this, we had 265 valid responses from participants across the group, and we had majority of participation from respondents from low and middle income countries, with 74% representation from LMICs. And to ensure that the uptake and implementation of the agenda, we have a wide dissemination strategy, which this webinar is part of. So I'll briefly go through an overview of who the respondents were who participated in the survey or in the priority setting process. And we had respondents from the violence against children, the childhood sexual violence, and the sexual and gender-based violence field represented, with participants working in both prevention and response. And most respondents were practitioners, followed by researchers. And we also had participation from INGOs, multilateral organizations, activists, healthcare and service providers, as well as social service and government representatives. So quite some diversity in terms of who responded to the survey, and a demonstration that this research agenda is not just for researchers, but also for the field at large. We also see more diversity in terms of representation when it comes to respondents' connection to marginalized population. And respondents indicated that they were either directly connected or professionally connected to marginalized populations. So several respondents either identify as or work with CSV survivors, survivors of adult sexual and gender-based violence, or survivors, racial or ethnic minorities, indigenous people, LGBTQI people, people with disabilities, human trafficking survivors, migrants or refugees. So again, we see quite a bit of diversity when it comes to participation. I'll now highlight the top 2 research priorities under each domain. But please note that the full report outlines the top 5 priorities in each domain and all the questions that were used for the online survey. So this is, because of time, I'll only be highlighting the top 2. Under domain 1, which was understanding CSV, the top priority question focuses on understanding the best strategies to help break the cycle of abuse or intergenerational trauma for CSV survivors. So we see a focus on a holistic approach that incorporates ending CSV and promoting healing for CSV survivors. The second question underscores the importance of understanding risk and protective factors, particularly in areas where CSV is prevalent, and using this understanding to shape the design of prevention interventions. Under domain 2, which is responding to CSV, we see a common thread of disclosure and reporting in the top 2 priority questions, with the first question calling for understanding of effective ways to address barriers to disclosure and reporting of CSV, including decreasing the stigma associated with CSV and providing children and youth with safe environments for disclosure. The second priority question is similar in the sense, but it seeks to, with focus on activities and interventions that are effective at increasing reporting of CSV and disclosure by boys and men. Under domain 3, which is preventing CSV, the top priority question recognizes the connection of CSV to social norms and points to the need for more research to understand the types of social norms interventions that have proven effective in decreasing occurrences of CSV. The second priority question in this domain highlights the issue of peer-to-peer perpetration, and this question is interested in research that seeks to understand effective strategies and interventions to prevent CSV perpetration among children and teens. Under domain 4, which was research methods in CSV, the top priority question is concerned with understanding how we can facilitate CSV survivor participation in CSV research, recognizing that this may come with adverse effects, including re-traumatization and re-victimization or increased vulnerability, among other adverse outcomes. So looking at how we can increase CSV participation while minimizing these adverse research outcomes that may come with disclosure or participation in CSV research by survivors. The second question recognizes that CSV is often underreported, even in research, and seeks to understand alternative data collection strategies or proxy outcomes that can be used to assess effectiveness of CSV prevention interventions. The last domain, which is CSV in marginalized and vulnerable population, and the top priority question looks at this domain looks at CSV among vulnerable populations, and the top priority question in this domain seeks to understand how CSV prevention and response interventions can be adapted for different groups of vulnerable and marginalized children and youth. And the second priority question under this domain is interested in understanding the barriers to reporting for CSV and accessing CSV response services, and how these differ among different groups of vulnerable and marginalized children and youth. Due to time limitations, we have only shared the top 2 research priorities, but the full report contains the full set of survey questions and the top 5 research priorities under each domain. The report also sheds light on the variances and nuances across different respondents, particularly by geographic location or population groups, and it is available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. So on our website, you already have the English, French, Spanish versions available, and the Arabic version will be available soon after this webinar. So in terms of the next steps, we have developed a communications and advocacy plan that outlines events and outputs such as this webinar, as well as publications and blogs, among other channels to promote uptake and utilization of the agenda. I'll now pass it over to Ashley, who was a member of the advisory group and also the stewardship group, who will help us to gain more insights on how this agenda can be used by different stakeholders. Over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for that wonderful overview of the CSV shared research agenda. It's clear from the rigorous and inclusive process you outlined that the agenda reflects the perspectives of an incredibly diverse set of stakeholders. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our expert panel, who will speak to us about how various groups of stakeholders, including donors, researchers, and practitioners, can use this new research agenda to advance this field. First, we will hear from Dr. Helena Duke, head of the Solutions Subprogram of the Prevent Child Sexual Abuse Program at Oak Foundation. Next, we will have Dr. Manjir Mukherjee, Senior Director for Strategic Operations at ARPAN. Then we will hear from Dr. Martin DiMarco, Assistant Professor in the Violence and Violence Prevention Research Group at Leiden University. We will also have Urvashi Gandhi, CEO of Samia Development Resource Private Limited and Asia Hub Coordinator for the Coalition of Good Schools. And finally, we will learn from Dvisha Nevatia, Learning Coordinator for Raising Voices in Uganda. Each of our panelists will have up to 5 minutes to share with us their thoughts. Over to you, Dr. Helena Duke. Thank you for kicking off our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this panel. It is really wonderful to be here with so many folks who are interested in CSV research. I would say from a funder's perspective, a research agenda is a gift because we funders aim to be responsive to field priorities, and we want to make sure that our funding is supporting what the field priorities are. So the research agenda kind of provides a roadmap just to do exactly that. And while we're very privileged as funders that we have a very broad view of the sector, our foundation's priorities and our practices in grant making often limit us to hearing from a very small group of actors, those that are in our closest circle. So the research agenda actually amplifies the voices of those who have informed priorities and gaps in the research, providing a much broader lens for us. This is evident by the data that Joan just presented. I was really pleased to read that the agenda was informed by 265 respondents, 74% of those coming from low and middle income countries. And I also really appreciate that the agenda was informed by practitioners, activists, governments, and not just researchers. So the agenda can give us confidence as funders that our funding is being instrumental to advance research that is helpful to the sector. I have to say, as a funder that is dedicated to funding research on sexual violence prevention, I was very glad to see that we're funding many of the key questions that have come up as priorities in the research agenda. But of course, our funding is very limited. The sector needs a lot more. So the agenda becomes a tool for us funders to collaborate and to coordinate with other donors so that we're supporting the different gaps that are in the area. And it also provides a roadmap for us to invite other donors to consider this area of work. It gives us a lot of legitimacy and credibility to say this is what the sector wants from a research perspective. And so it allows us also to use the research agenda as a tool for advocacy, because it gives us all a joint roadmap of priorities that we can use to influence and support the kind of evidence-based grant making and evidence-based priorities that we want to see. And finally, I will say that I think the agenda can also be very helpful in fostering innovation. I think what's been really fascinating to me in looking at the different priorities is that in the areas of work highlighted, some of them are more advanced, we're further along in our understanding, but there's some other areas of work where we're in the very nascent stages. And so we're going to have to fund very differently. How do we promote innovation? How do we create spaces where we can really tackle some of these questions where we know a lot less, and to start to fill those gaps and programs accordingly. So I'm just thrilled that we have this tool as a sector. I think it brings us together in our joint resolve to end child sexual violence. And I'm really thankful for everybody who contributed and participated. So I'll leave my remarks here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duke. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Manjir.
Hi, thanks, Helena and Ashleigh, for kind of the space and kind of having the opportunity to talk about it, the research agenda. Actually, this has been a long process of being part of the advisory group. So the agenda is pretty close to our heart. And I think as a research agenda, what it would find, like the road ahead will really be able to take on the academic research with real world challenges to help them meet each other. I think that is also what the process has been. Optimize resource allocation and promote evidence-based solutions. To start off, I'd like to focus on the geographical imbalance that currently exists in research. The research on child sexual violence prevention and intervention in low and middle income countries, it's only 12%, which kind of is very disproportionate, and it limits any kind of development of tailored prevention and response strategies. It also kind of hinders the dissemination of effective solutions from LMICs to other global learning. So it's always very top down. It's always like Western research, which is influencing interventions in LMICs, whereas the LMIC also has a lot to offer. I think this research agenda, I think, places it in that context very well. We heard from Helena from Oak, and really fortunate for Oak funding research in LMICs, and ARPAN has been one of the partners of them. But I think this research agenda will kind of also open up other organizations, funding bodies, really looking at the priority settings and where it is needed most. Global Challenges Research Fund, I understand, has already taken that initiative, and it's really, and that's how I think researchers will really be able to drive this, not only to kind of sharpen research, but also as a tool to prioritize research in LMIC. What that would lead to is basically lead to another strategic priority, which is basically standardizing measurement across tool. If I look at it from a research perspective, I think the challenge that lies is data sets, which is not comparable across countries, across regions, and even within country itself, especially for a country like India, which is so vast and with so diversities. Like even the recent meta-analysis shows prevalence ranging from some 8% to 30%. Like that kind of a wide range is really not helping in developing any kind of intervention on programs. So I think that is another area that it will really help. The third that I wanted to kind of address is balancing foundational research and applied research. I think as researchers, we're always challenged, as with any other sectors, to find out where should research energy be invested in. And I think this research agenda really creates a very fine balance between research which will be towards innovations and research a basic inquiry, and research which will also create sustainable impact by evaluating existing solutions and programs. If I have to look into the research questions that Joanne highlighted, I'd like to talk about 3 specifically here. One about the proxy outcomes which assess CSV prevention. So at Arpan, we have been evaluating school-based abuse prevention program. Arpan runs a prevention program, and we recently evaluated it after a 4 years intervention period. 90% of children have been able to build the agency to participate in their own safety, and 82% have healed from negative impact of abuse. The results are promising, but what we need as researchers is proxy indicators which will help us talk about how prevention programs actually contribute to reduction of CSB. Some indicators which have been useful in other countries like school absenteeism, utilization of healthcare facilities for STIs. How can we create a composite set of indicators which is also very responsive to cultural needs, which will actually help us assess the long-term efficacy of school-based programs and not limit it only to retention of knowledge and skills? The next priority question that I would like to address is social norms, and how do we create interventions which actually addresses effective social norm solutioning. As we all know, it doesn't need to be said that social norms reinforce and perpetuate gender-based violence. And in a recent study, again done by Arpan in a baseline study, what we found that 42% of adults believe children should not refuse requests from adult even if they feel uncomfortable. And 50% of teachers felt that it is a child fault if they're abused. If these are such stark social norms that exist in the country, and I'm sure these are not norms which are only in India, it's norms that cuts across the global space, I think it's very important that we create parameters to evaluate interventions and solutions which are created for changing social norms. Some of these can be creating validated social norm scales using artificial information tools like natural language processing to do text analysis, sentiment detection. But as researchers, we need to create hybrid, validated, reliable metrics that will combine scale, proxies, and participatory feedback. Yeah. The last one, and not the list, is basically how do we develop and contextualize culturally sensitive survival-led methodologies. We definitely need children's voices when we are doing research, but at the same time, how do we use technologies, how do we use ethical guidelines so that they're survivor-centered and we are not doing more harm than good. With that, I would like to just conclude by saying that the agenda will definitely foster collaboration across sectors, discipline, and geographies, and it will align researchers and practitioners and will transform fragmented efforts into cohesive global actions. And I think that will be powerful to change the narrative. With that, I'll request Martin to take it ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and comment on this fabulous work. I've of course have prepared some notes and sort of a small discussion, but now I think we'll integrate some of the questions that I'm hearing that I'm reading in the chat. So it's what I'm going to say now. It's linked with my experience working within the specific field of femicide and my experience working in the use of knowledge in public health. So how do we use knowledge within that very specific niche? And there are two basic questions that we have with any type of research agenda in general that we might have. The how and the why, or the other way around, why and how. Why do we need these and how we might use it? Both of them have their specific challenges. Both of them leave something quite in the open, which is that ultimately we're talking about decisions. The decisions we have about how do we do research or how do we use knowledge and how do we move as a group of humans or mammals doing something at the same time. And there's one thing, which is an assumption or the premise, which is actually, it's a fact, which is that science is extremely fragmented for many different reasons. We can go back in time and see the history of science and academia in itself, it's complicated in itself. But it's fragmented. It's fragmented by funding. It's fragmented by geography, culture, traditions, and disciplines, right? But this has a very specific consequence for us, which is to some degree anomie, right? We're talking about a group of people doing research, but they're not talking to each other usually in unison. So we're quite fragmented. And this, it's not something random. It fosters having potentially competing into each other. So it basically might foster a neoliberal type of academia. If everyone's doing whatever they want, so there's something there about not thinking collectively that affects us strongly. And I'm not saying it's easy to think collectively. It's again about decisions. And I think that an agenda of this nature, which is so extremely useful, as I was said before, and there are many different layers as well about that, is that it highlights what agreements we can have. We are diverse, but what disagreements we might have as well. And there's a huge value for us as academics or people working with academia and knowledge in highlighting both of those things. Which are the questions that we can agree on and say, this is important, but at the same time, which are the disagreements we're having about those questions? If we are fragmented, we just sweep under the carpet that, and we're not actually addressing the fact that that might be a disagreement, but it would be really nice for us, and it's really useful for us to have it clear. We don't agree on this. We can work or not on that later. And I would say that then it's the question of how. This agenda is phenomenal in terms of being specific and starting a conversation about union and unison of thinking about such an important topic. And on the one hand, by default, it should create a network, because we now have questions that are being posted, that are being written down in a very material way, and that for instance, in my field in femicide, those agendas, those convenings and those papers sometimes bring us together. And SVRI is doing that currently. It's doing that, is bringing us together into a conversation with conflict and with disagreements. But it's what we want. We want in this current state, political state, we need that space. We can use it. And of course, the most obvious thing for this how question is that it focuses our agenda. It might. So if we know that these are the questions that haven't been answered, or they've been answered in a certain way, and we need that, we need that to use that knowledge, to produce that knowledge, our agendas might be focused. It's not just, I want to study this, I want to study that. The funder is saying this, the funder is saying that. We have a good justification for focusing our work, because we are extremely, and I'm talking about academics specifically, very individualistic. We're just publishing papers sometimes. If we're not working with public health, even more in certain branches of social sciences. And at the same time, this having an agenda can hopefully foster certain form of communication and connection with other sectors. So the tricky part here is that there's no mechanical relationship between knowledge and the use of the knowledge. We know that it's extremely political, it's fragmented by so many different things, but at least we're starting having a conversation of how to use that, and establishing that and fostering that communication. It's connected with so many things. It's the thing that we need, because we can have a conversation about something that's usually implicit. What are we doing research on? And most importantly, why? The bottom line about this, and this is one of the things that I was reading in the chat, is it's a matter of decision and use. We have an agenda, how do we use it? And I was reading something about geopolitics and colonial relationships, and I understand that perfectly well, because it's ultimately, now we have these questions. How are we going to think about the strategies to do this research? What about the relationship between researchers from this country, from this region and the other region? How are resources being distributed? But that, to some degree, this will be perhaps a simplistic understanding of it. To some degree, these, when spoken, creates a different scenario. When we are addressing it, we have an agenda, and we're actually acknowledging that there is not only disagreement, but also inequality within our field. It's a huge step, because then we can work on, if we have the will, if we have the political momentum and power. So I think an agenda of this nature is extremely useful for us as a group, but it's also eye-opening in terms of we're political in nature. We're using this, and we can be quite, I don't like the term conscious, but we can be aware of it and ultimately use it to our advantage. And I think that's what I wanted to say. And thank you for the comments in the chats and the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Over to Urvashi, please.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to the other speakers. Thank you, Joanne and SVRI, for initiating the process and the efforts that have gone into, putting this together. As a practitioner, for me to be part of a research setting agenda, it was a new experience. And for me, what the highlight was that practitioners and researchers came together to co-create a space which can really inform a new and emerging field. So at every step of the way, I think Martin said it, that there were spaces where we agreed and there were spaces where there were so many views that it was difficult to come together. I'm also representing the Coalition for Good Schools, and for us, voices from Global South are being represented in spaces of where any form of agenda setting is done. It's very critical. And we feel that voices from Global South need to inform agenda setting in policy influencing spaces, and also where programs are being discussed about Global South. So experiences from Global South and how their voices get reflected in various documents and programmatic interventions mean a lot. I think that was very key to the way we engaged in the process. And what some of the things that we really look for when this agenda setting process is done and we actually come into implementing it, we are looking at innovations. What is working? What is not working? Where are the innovations or the best practices happening? What are some of the strategies that have worked? And how can we better shape our prevention as well as redressal programs? I think without both those aspects, it will be very difficult. I think Manjari very briefly spoke about the social norms and how violence is justified. And when it comes to sexual violence, that is hardly ever spoken. And it is one of the toughest issues to really, crack open a conversation. I have worked for many years with women and girls around this, and I see that children are even more they're not allowed spaces where they can share these experiences. And when we were doing this agenda setting processes, what was running in our mind was that how do we make it more intersectional? How do we gather data that can help us build an intersectional lens from the very beginning, so that the programs and interventions can then be informed by it? So the LGBTQI community representation, and how do we bring probably marginalization based on, say, children of sex work or homeless children or children who stay in shelter homes. There was so much, and in fact there were a lot of diversity of ideas, and we could sense that the dearth of knowledge on these aspects were really missing. I think for me, this is what this research agenda is doing. And I would love to see how, once we have data around this, better can we inform our policy influencing and policy making spaces. So I will pause here and I will hand it over to Tavisha.
Thanks, Urvashi. And thanks to all the panelists. As someone who works at the intersection of research and practice, this collective agenda setting process and this discussion even is so exciting. I will be answering the same question as Urvashi around how can practitioners apply this research agenda? Why is it useful? And firstly, I'd just like to start by emphasizing that addressing child sexual violence is absolutely non-negotiable in preventing violence against children. And so this priority setting exercise helps bring focus to this very under-researched and difficult, yet a very critical area. And these priorities, as a advisory group, we also reflected on which criteria to use in selecting these priorities. And two of them were applicability and effectiveness. So to really actually bring this vision to life of research being applicable and leading to effectiveness, practitioners need to be part of the process, sharing contextual, on-the-ground realities, shaping research questions and solutions. And moreover, in my experience, like research and practice are deeply intertwined and they reinforce each other. Therefore, this agenda not only reflects evidence gaps, but also potential gaps in practice. And from my side, here are 3 ways practitioners can apply the agenda. Firstly, by contributing our own practice-based knowledge to fill the evidence gaps. Firstly, as practitioners, we can review the priorities through the lens of our work. We can critically think about where our work fits into this agenda. And as we engage with the priorities, we can ask ourselves questions. Does this really resonate as an evidence gap? Or do we already have insights from practice that haven't been well documented? Practitioners have important insights emerging from our practice-based learning. For example, insights on underreporting and safe disclosure, what makes an intervention effective, but often this knowledge may not be shared outside our organizations. Additionally, like our own practice-based knowledge can explain why certain gaps persist. For example, here, like we see the stigma or practical barriers in researching and addressing teacher-perpetrated sexual violence or peer sexual violence. And so as practitioners, we can actively share these insights and contribute to a body of evidence and a more comprehensive and contextual knowledge based on child sexual violence. Secondly, practitioners can also integrate the research priorities into our own kind of learning processes, program evaluations, and research collaborations. So connecting this agenda with our own program learning goals, including monitoring, evaluation, and so on, it helps us be in touch with broader questions the field is asking, making it easier to kind of connect and exchange relevant lessons with one another, contribute to ongoing debates and innovations, and kind of fill the gap which is currently there, as explained by many, in terms of the fragmented nature of our work. Relatedly, this tool can also help be a bridge between researchers and practitioners, supporting them in ensuring that collaborative research focuses on generating evidence that actually strengthens programming and impact and also expands the overall evidence base. Last but not the least, like others have already said, the agenda can really support around advocacy for research, policy, programming. It reminds us of the most pressing evidence gaps and the children most at risk, especially as kind of gaps in protection services widen in many settings. It can be useful to influence national research and policy agendas. And it also highlights several under-researched areas, such as experience of marginalized communities, response of justice systems, and many more. And it really prompts us to ask, why are these issues under-researched? And are there like specific structural barriers that are preventing attention to these? And further, the agenda reinforces ethical commitments for researchers and practitioners to child-centered, safe participation in child sexual violence research, something we can advocate for and model in our work. So I will just end by really encouraging practitioners who are thinking about this to explore the report, especially the top 5 research questions and emerging themes. And this agenda is definitely not just for researchers, it's for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Vasha and to all of our wonderful panelists. I'd like to now open up our Q&A. Please use the question and answer feature in the Zoom. And we'll start with a question that I think we'll pose to Dr. Manjir. Rajiv Roy has asked about how can we truly integrate practitioner-based knowledge and expertise with academic research? How do we promote a collaborative co-traveler approach between practitioners and academic researchers, ensuring their combined expertise informs the entire research process from design and implementation to analysis and dissemination, and contribute to the decolonization of research practices? I'll ask Dr. Manjir if you could answer that question, and then I'll turn to Joanne if you can look at some of the questions on disability next. Thanks. Over to you, Manjir.
Thanks, Rajiv, for asking that question. I think being situated in the intersection of being a practitioner and a researcher, I think this is a question that all of us are kind of want to bridge this gap. And I think this research agenda is one step towards that, because this creates a collaborative process to understand the value that both brings to the process. I think the hierarchy between academicians and practitioners need to go away, and they need to kind of start working in equal footing. And when they start doing that, I think then only this collaborative co-traveler approach and practitioners and academicians working together that you're talking about will actually be possible. Some of the places where we think that we have been able to use it is kind of working with academicians while looking at research as part of a practitioner organizations, looking it together from the academic rigor, bringing in the practitioners' field experiences, views, voices from the field together to create the research agenda, to design it together, bringing in child participation at the design stage, not only at the stage of data collection, but kind of thinking about the process from the starting of the research process as a process which is kind of co-led. So maybe those have been some of our experiences of doing it together.
Thank you so much, Manjeer. And Joanne, would you be able to come on and speak to us a little bit about these two questions related to both lived experience and inclusion of voices of children living with disabilities, including things like autism and or intellectual disabilities in the research agenda?
Thanks, Ashley. So in terms of ensuring participation of people with lived experiences, we did this through several ways. And we use qualitative processes, as I described earlier in the presentation. So because the Chindri method is largely quantitative, we were not able to, or rather to get the participation of people with lived experiences or people that are often marginalized or excluded from these processes. We had to adapt the process a bit more through FGDs, that is focus group discussions. And we also used qualitative interviews, so to reach out to people with disabilities, LGBTQI+ people, also to reach out to CSV survivors, to reach out to Indigenous people and people with disabilities. I think I've mentioned that. So we use qualitative methods, and we invited participation from these groups of people at different processes. So in the advisory group, we had participation of CSV survivors. We also, I mentioned the qualitative approach to it, but also in the ranking process, we ensured that we reached out to groups of people, partners who are working with different kinds of marginalized and people who are often vulnerable. And there was also a question about, people in conflict or war situations. And we also reached out to partners who work with migrants, refugees, people who have experienced conflict, people in situations, those kind of situations, conflict and migration settings. So different approaches to ensure adequate participation, or rather inclusion of groups that we really wanted to include. And one other thing that we kept doing is looking at who the survey respondents were. So seeing what groups are not represented adequately and actively reaching out to partners and organizations that would allow us then to reach to these groups.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you for responding on the question about conflict in the chat as well. Let's see, are there, let's see, if there are any questions in Arabic, please do include those in the chat. I think there are a couple of questions from the French chat. Thank you, Manuela, for translating those. I see one question from let's see, from the French chat. How did we obtain this information, given that acts of violence are often committed by close acquaintances? And then there's another question: what tools and mechanisms do you use to make this data credible? Joanne, would you be interested in taking those two questions too, from the methodological standpoint?
Please come again, Ashley.
Yes, the first question is, how did you obtain this information, given that acts of violence are often committed by close acquaintances? And another question from the French chat, what tools and mechanisms do you use to make this this data credible? I'm thinking this one perhaps is asking about like how we use the RAG reading to show that we're really representing voices of stakeholders.
Yes. I think because we were not really getting personal experiences, so this was not research per se, but really identification of research priorities. So we were not looking for people to share their personal experiences. So in that sense, we did not need to address a lot of the, the surveillance issues or the restrictions to participate. And also because we engaged, children and young people through our partners. These were people who are already familiar with our partner programs. So in that sense, there was a lot more credibility in terms of having these groups of people participate because the partners are already known in those communities. So we use strategies that will ensure that we work with already existing mechanism instead of reinventing the wheel, and also structures that will allow us to get credibility when we are getting into the communities or we are interacting with the groups that you are interested in. And then in terms of credibility, we had quite a robust group of experts representing practitioners, researchers, INGOs, different stakeholders. So people with a lot of different professional experience from different backgrounds, from different kinds of professions. And in that sense, I think, and also the engagement, because there was a lot of engagement, as Manji explained, those monthly meetings with the advisory group, periodic meetings with the stewardship group. So continuous reflection on the process, questioning and challenging the process, and ensuring that we are actually going through a process that will produce credible research questions. And of course, inviting participation from stakeholders in the field. And also just to note that in addition to the quantitative process, we allowed stakeholders to, or rather the participants who are participating in the global ranking, to provide written sentiments. So there were questions, there were comments, which are also analyzed a lot in the report. So if you can look at the report, you can see some of the nuances that come with this research agenda setting process.
Thank you so much, Joanne. We have another question. In the socio-litigation space, particularly in rural areas like Bihar, India, many organizations lack the necessary resources and training to respond effectively while adhering to ethical principles when working with survivors of childhood sexual violence. How can we address this gap and ensure that organizations are better equipped to handle these cases with ethical sensitivity and survivor-centered approaches? Additionally, how can we strengthen the role of research in shaping ethical and effective interventions rather than relying solely on evidence-based practices? Tavisha, I think you spoke a bit about this issue and about the importance of ethical standards. Would you be willing to take this question?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question. And I think that's really what the reality is in many spaces. So I think there could be many ways to think about it, but I think we need to think about how are we supporting some of these local kind of organizations which are doing a lot of the work but don't have the support. And it kind of starts from funding, then I think making our knowledge more accessible. I know that SVRI has some, and like Prevention Collaborative, like organizations like this have a lot of courses. And I think if that is the direction the field is moving towards, providing a lot of this knowledge for practitioners who are working, I think we need to prioritize that even more. But I think really a lot of the work is being done by a lot of such organizations. And I think just to firstly like value their own experience and then connect, kind of creating those connections with other organizations could also be really helpful. And I think the second question is also really important because it's very key that we are not just focusing on interventions that have been kind of proven successful, but there is space for innovation and for researchers and practitioners to come together and really think about like what has not been addressed and how can we research that. And I think researchers can play a role. For example, at Raising Voices, there are spaces where research we come together with researchers to kind of co-create our interventions. But I think really making sure that when you do that as practitioners, you're really in the driving seat of the kind of interventions that you're thinking about what you're learning critically. So I think thoughtful kind of partnerships like that can really go a long way. Yeah, I think Urvashi wanted to say something, so I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Tavisha, for going first. I was trying to think as to how do I respond to this question. So from our personal experience, what I have seen is that building in components, when we as practitioners, we sometimes do know where there is going to be some kind of a harm that we're going to cause. I think, and we do think about it when we are doing risk mitigation or thinking through what could be the probable risk and mitigate for it. Especially when we're working with children, what is important, as you rightly said, Tavisha, is that having some local groups who are part of the intervention is great. One biggest concern that we have with regards to child sexual violence survivors is that where are the safe spaces? If the home is unsafe, where is the other safe space that where we can keep a child? That is one of the biggest question, and unfortunately we don't have answers for it, especially coming from a country like India. The other aspect is that if you're building programs, safeguarding and components of safeguarding, doing no harm, being accountable to communities is an important tenet around which programming needs to be centered. Apart from ensuring that we are looking through a survivor-centered, creating a survivor-centered space or safe spaces, I think safeguarding lens would go a long way in ensuring that we are able to bring those principles in, where we keep people who are working with children as well as children safe, especially when we're talking about any forms of violence and sexual. I don't have to say how critical it is for a sexual violence survivor to be, ensured that they are feeling safe and secure. So it is also coming from the space that safeguarding could lend a sense of can inform your risk mitigation activities as well. So that might help practitioners to be able to create safer environments. I'll pause here, and Ashley, back to you.
Thank you so much, Urvashi, and thank you to all of our panelists for elucidating so many opportunities for this research agenda to move our field forward. I wish we had 2 more hours for this fruitful discussion, but for now we will turn to Claire Bangirana, Director of Research and Knowledge Development at the AfriChild Center for Excellence, to close this session. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you to the wonderful panelists and all the previous speakers. Today marks more than just the launch of a research agenda. It's a defining moment in a shared responsibility to protect children. This agenda is not just a document, it's a call to action, a call to amplify voices, close critical knowledge gaps, and drive real and lasting change. One theme that has run through all the speakers that have spoken today is that this is just the beginning. So let's be clear, research alone is not enough. It must lead to policies that protect and interventions that heal, and a future where every child is safe. To our incredible panelists, thank you very much for your invaluable insights. And to each of you who joined us today, your presence and engagement reaffirm the urgency of this work. Childhood sexual violence is a crisis that demands a collective, evidence-driven response. This agenda, therefore, provides the roadmap to guide research, inform policies, and strengthen interventions in the places that need it the most. And what makes it really unique and truly powerful is the way it was developed, as Joanne shared, with the voices of researchers, survivors, advocates, and practitioners at the center. It is a result of a collaborative and inclusive process, bringing together diverse voices to ensure it reflects real-world priorities. It serves as a guide to bridge gaps, research gaps in low and middle income countries and to drive meaningful change where it is needed most. It's an agenda developed for the field, by the field. But this is just the beginning. Like every speaker has said and reiterated, it is just the beginning. It's up to all of us, researchers, funders, policymakers, and practitioners to turn these priorities into action. I urge all of us to utilize this agenda and integrate it into our work, fund its priorities, share outputs that align with these priorities, and turn the findings into stronger policies, and ensure that the knowledge we generate is used to protect children and support survivors. A heartfelt thank you to everyone who made this possible, our advisory group, the global expert group, the stewardship group. Your dedication has laid the foundation for a future where research can drive real and lasting change. Together, we can and must create a safer future for our children. With that, we formally close this webinar. Thank you very much.